I genuinely struggle to understand how pretty much nobody is talking about this. We have top-level executives of the biggest tech company in the world casually lying in court and disobeying court orders, and I don't see anyone say a peep about that. Why is that? Apple has just lost a major lawsuit, and the outcome of it reveals the deepest levels of corruption and obstruction in the history of the big tech, I believe. Many companies are facing similar lawsuits in the US and other countries, but with Apple, things are much worse and way darker. People could realistically go to jail over this, and Apple as a company could be held criminally liable. I've never seen this happen in any other big tech company, and it's that much more confusing to me that nobody's talking about this. So stay with me because I'm going to show you all the details and information you need to know. I've talked about this way sooner than this video comes out. I made 2 episodes on my podcast already, worth more than 1 hour of content. I highly recommend you check it out by joining in patreon.com/thehatedone. I literally have hundreds of episodes of content there about the research and analysis that never make it to my YouTube channel. Now let me get you up to speed with everything you need to know that's been going on. In 2021, Apple lost a major lawsuit against Epic Games. Epic Games is a video game publisher behind Fortnite, and they also had their gaming store, similar to Steam and Xbox Store. Now, Epic Games sued Apple for their draconian rules around Apple's mandatory 30% commission on all in-app purchases made in apps installed on iOS, the operating system on the iPhone. According to Apple's policies, developers of third-party apps would have to direct all of their transactions through Apple's proprietary payment system. The problem wasn't just with the payment system itself, it was mostly with Apple's policy that if developers tried to avoid it, they would be harshly punished for it. If developers didn't want to pay a 30% commission, Apple's closed-off ecosystem wouldn't give them any other choice. It wouldn't be, for instance, possible to install apps on iOS through a different app store like it is possible to do so on Android. On the iPhone, everything had to go through Apple. The only thing that developers could do is that they could try to tell their users to go to their website and make a purchase through their own payment system instead of using Apple's in-app purchases on iOS. Using these third-party payment methods would mean Apple would not be able to collect their 30% commission, and they would be losing that revenue. This is very bad for Apple because there is no real technological way to prevent this. After all, developers can just talk to their customers directly. They can send them a text or an email or a notification telling them to use a PIN method outside of Apple, and that's it. Developers could even entice their customers with a generous 20% discount and still earn more profit than they would with Apple's payments. Since Apple couldn't prevent this with technology, they turned to their power, using tactics that would put even the Italian mafia to shame. Apple would literally extort developers violating their policies with a complete ban and removal of their apps from the App Store. You might think that's the cost of doing business, not a big deal, iOS controls less than 20% of the market. Losing that is survivable. But for developers, Apple is much more powerful than that. Consumer app spending is a $400 billion business. In 2024, iOS controlled 68% of all app spending across the board, 53% of app spending in games, and 73% of all subscription revenues go to Apple's pockets. In other words, Apple's marketplace is such a powerful force, it's a damn near monopoly. The only relevant competitor is the Google Play Store, but if you as a developer lose Apple, you might as well just apply for a new job. Your business is over. No company, no matter how big, could afford to risk losing up to 2/3 of their revenue. This is a similar mafia tactic employed by many of these big tech marketplace platforms, including Amazon, Google, or Valve, the maker of Steam. The problem with this extortionist behavior is that it is illegal, and no other company has been willing to push their illegal practice as far as Apple did. Apple wouldn't just punish developers who would direct their customers to a different payment method by a pop-up inside the app. Apple would prohibit developers from using emails, texts, and any other points of contact to direct their customers to other purchasing mechanisms. The reason this is illegal is because it is a fundamentally anti-competitive conduct which directly leads to higher prices for users. By effectively banning all communication, developers couldn't even make their users aware a cheaper option might be available to them outside of Apple's walled garden. And the reason this is anti-competitive is that it gives Apple's products and services an unfair advantage, since their apps don't have to pay any 30% commission. For instance, Spotify and Apple Music might have the same pricing, but Spotify on iOS will earn 30% less than Apple. Spotify could raise their price to offset the commission, but then Apple's offering would become cheaper. In either case, Apple wins and developer loses. It's not just other developers and businesses Apple is hurting with their practice. Their 30% tax is primarily hurting customers. It's inflating prices of apps and services across the board, oftentimes resulting in price parity with other platforms since developers can't entice users with better offering outside of Apple. In the US antitrust enforcement, you may get away with being as monopolistic as you want to be, but the moment you begin financially hurting customers, that's when regulators finally drop the ban hammer on you. In the Epic Games lawsuit against Apple, the court has recognized something really remarkable here. They called it the lifetime cost of an ecosystem. You don't just pay a premium for Apple products at the point of sale. Apple is raising your costs throughout your use of their products, and they prevent you from being able to attribute that cost to Apple in the first place. Because of this, the court has decided to act against Apple on the grounds of a previous precedent with the American Express. Like Apple, American Express also tried to prohibit sellers from steering customers to Visa and MasterCard. But Apple's case is far worse than this because Apple would forbid developers from disclosing that their options might even exist. In fact, developers wouldn't even be allowed to mention Apple's 30% cut was a factor in their pricing at all. Apple didn't just create a walled garden, they purposefully built an information black box around their system so that they could lock their users in and squeeze more money out of them. Now, all of this has been ruled to be illegal, but that doesn't usually mean criminal, nor does it imply personal liability of company executives. Google has also recently been ruled to be an illegal monopoly, twice in fact, but Apple stepped over the line in their defense. In fact, this implicates the very top of Apple's management, all the way up to Tim Cook himself. In 2021, Apple was ordered to allow developers to communicate to their customers better pricing and purchasing options outside of Apple. What the court wanted Apple to do was to remove barriers and stop discouraging users and developers from using third-party payment options. But that's not how Apple decided to comply with the order. Apple considered two options. One was to allow third-party purchases with no commission but significantly restrict where developers could place links to outside payments. Basically, requiring the button for the outside payment to be displayed on a different page than the in-app purchase button. The second option was to allow third-party purchases without restrictions so they could be placed alongside the in-app purchase button, but Apple would charge a 27% commission instead of 30%, basically introducing an entirely new commission in place where it didn't exist before. Apple considered these options internally to figure out which one would result in the least revenue lost. Eventually, the executive decision was made to do both of them. That is, introduce a new 27% commission and restrict where developers can place links to outside payment options. Apple internally analyzed where users are most likely to make a purchase and specifically instructed developers not to place their payment options there and only include Apple's system. Where users did find the developer's payment method, Apple would introduce scare screens and pop-ups, warning them such payments might be dangerous and not secure. None of this was complying with the law, and Apple knew this. Philip Schiller even directly advised Tim Cook against this strategy and for complying with the court fully. Tim Cook chose to ignore Schiller and let his chief financial officer Luca Maestri to go with the non-compliant plan. When Apple was called back to court, the company withheld critical evidence about these internal discussions, especially all those involving the top-level executives. In later court testimonies, Apple's VP of Finance Alex Roman outright lied under oath to hide the truth about these executive decisions. Apple also tried to mislead the court by providing false information about their processes and decision-making, riddling their testimonies with misdirection and outright lies. All of this suggests serious crimes might have been committed. That's why the judge decided to pass the matter to a U.S. attorney to investigate for criminal contempt. This means Apple as a company, as well as some of their top executives, could be held criminally liable and even end up in jail. But unfortunately, that's not the decision for the judge, but for the U.S. government. And I worry that despite all of this, nothing will happen, and once again, a big corporation will be shown to be above the law. If you did a fraction of what Apple and their executives did, you'd have the book thrown at your face so hard, you'd become Facebook. And here's why I don't have my hopes up for an actual criminal investigation against Apple and their crooks. Did you know that Tim Cook and Donald Trump have had a long-standing personal relationship? Lots of people were somehow surprised to hear that Cook personally donated $1 million to Trump's 2024 inauguration. You know, because Cook is such a lib and so gay. But what I'm about to show you should convince you that the elite class has no real politics. Tim Cook had decided to build a personal rapport with Donald Trump well during his first term in 2016. And rather than sending his lobbyists to vouch for him, Cook would set up one-on-one meetings with Trump directly. He would carefully craft his agenda to align with Trump's interests to get his attention. They would have frequent phone calls and meals together. They would do public appearances and endorsements of one another when it came to common issues. Cook even managed to convince Trump to scale back his original tariff plan in 2019 when he gave exceptions to the iPhone and other electronics. When there was trouble in foreign lands, when Apple faced fines and charges in other countries, Cook would run to Trump for good old protectionist help. Trump even admitted as much in a podcast when he said,
but Tim, I got to get elected first, but I'm not going to let them take advantage of our companies.
To get even closer to the Trump dynasty, Cook cozied up to his daughter Ivanka Trump and her husband Jared Kushner. So now that criminal prosecution is in the hands of the executive branch, how likely do you think this will go through? I've been saying this for the longest time. Apple is not your friend. It's an empire of evil. The corporation has spent its whole existence advocating and lobbying against your consumer rights so that they could price gouge you at every opportunity. They collaborate with governments all over the world to spy on your personal data, to crack down on your freedom of speech. And if you think you're stuck with the iPhone, don't. The truly best solution out there right now is Graphene OS, a private and secure operating system that doesn't require an account and is completely free. I've been talking about ways to set up a private phone on my channel for many years, and I highly recommend you check out more of my content. There is lots of it on my channel, and there is so much more on my Patreon podcast. I made this video without any sponsorship deal nor affiliation, so it is essential that you support my work by joining in patreon.com/thehitedone. Thank you.